My son said, "Don't expect me to take care of you in old age. I have my own family." I silently nodded. The next day I changed one line in my will. When he found out, he was standing at my door. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Holloway. Most people who love me call me Maggie. I am 68 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that the most painful wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people you once held in your arms when they were small enough to fit. I spent 32 years working as a pediatric nurse at Hartford Hospital in Connecticut. I know what it means to care for someone who cannot care for themselves. I know what it smells like, what it costs, what it demands of you. I gave that kind of care to my patients, and I gave it even more completely to my family. When my husband, Robert Holloway, was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's at 54, I became his nurse, his advocate, his companion through 7 years of slow decline. I held his hand the morning he died. I made sure he was never alone, never afraid, never without dignity. After Robert passed, I had 2 children, my son Daniel, 43, and my daughter Claire, 39. Claire lives in Portland, Oregon. She calls me every Sunday without fail, and when she visits, she sleeps in the guest room and makes me coffee in the mornings. And we sit on the back porch and watch the birds at the feeder Robert, installed the summer before he got sick. Those visits feel like breathing. Daniel is different. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it as a fact, the way you'd say the sky is gray on a November morning. Daniel has always been driven, ambitious in the way that Robert and I once admired and encouraged. He graduated top of his class at UConn, went into finance, married a woman named Brittany 6 years ago. Brittany is the kind of person who enters a room and immediately begins rearranging it. Not the furniture, but the people. She has sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and she had made it quietly, persistently clear since the wedding that I was a complication in Daniel's life rather than a cornerstone of it. In the beginning, I told myself I was imagining it. The first holiday season after the wedding, Brittany announced they would be spending Thanksgiving with her family in Scottsdale. I cooked a turkey anyway and ate it with Claire over video call, laughing about nothing in particular. The year after that, it was Christmas. Daniel called on the 26th to say they had been overwhelmed with travel. He didn't ask how I had spent the day. By the 3rd year, the calls had thinned. If I rang him on a Tuesday, he'd call back Thursday briefly between meetings. When I mentioned my knee surgery, a routine replacement, nothing dramatic, he sent flowers to the hospital. A card from both of them, signed by Brittany's handwriting. He did not visit. I notice these things the way you notice water rising slowly in a basement, not all at once, just gradually, until one day you look down and realize you're already standing in it. The evening it all came to a head was a Saturday in late September. Daniel had driven up from Fairfield to collect some of his father's things. Old golf clubs, a set of tools, a watch Robert had always promised him. I had made dinner. Pot roast, because it was his favorite as a boy. The house smelled the way it always had when he was growing up, and for a moment when he walked through the door, I thought, foolishly, hopefully, that things might be all right. We ate mostly in silence. He scrolled his phone between bites. Afterward, we sat in the living room, and I mentioned gently, carefully, that I had been thinking about the future, about what the next 10 or 15 years might look like. I was not asking for anything specific. I was simply opening a door. He set down his coffee cup. "Mom," he said, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard before. Not cold exactly, but sealed, like a room with no windows. "I want to be clear about something. Don't expect me to be the one to take care of you when you get old. I have my own family now, my own priorities. That's just the reality." He said it the way a person says something they've rehearsed, easily, without flinching. I looked at him across the coffee table. This man I had carried, nursed, cheered for, defended, loved with the entirety of what I had, and I felt something shift deep inside me, not collapse, shift, like a fault line settling. I nodded, just once, quietly. "All right," I said. He left an hour later with Robert's golf clubs loaded in the trunk. I stood in the doorway and watched his tail lights disappear at the end of the driveway. Then I went inside, washed the dishes, and sat in Robert's armchair by the window for a very long time. I did not cry. I was thinking. The house was quiet that night in a way it rarely is. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you hear your own heartbeat. I sat in Robert's armchair until the clock on the mantel read 11:15. Then I got up, poured myself 2 fingers of scotch, something I almost never do, and carried it to the kitchen table, where I spread out the folders I keep in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. The important ones: insurance policies, investment accounts, the deed to the house, and the will. Robert and I had written the will together in 2018, 2 years before he died. We had sat across from our estate attorney, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Marsh, in his Farmington office and made our decisions carefully, deliberately. The house, the retirement accounts, the life insurance payout that had come after Robert died, all of it divided equally between Daniel and Claire, 50-50. That had seemed right at the time. Fair. The kind of thing you do when you assume your children are who you raise them to be. I read through the document slowly, every paragraph. I had not looked at it since the week after Robert's funeral. What does it mean, I wondered, to leave half of everything you built over a lifetime to someone who has already decided you are not worth his time? Is that generosity, or is it simply being a fool with a pen? I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. Not afraid of Daniel, not physically, not yet, but afraid of what the act of changing something would mean. It would mean acknowledging, officially, irrevocably, that the version of my son I had believed in was not entirely real, that some of what I had seen across that coffee table was the truth of who he had become. Mothers do not want to believe that. We spend decades not believing it, but I had spent 7 years watching Robert's disease strip away everything inessential until only the core of a person remained. What I had seen in Daniel's face on Saturday evening was not stress, not exhaustion, not a bad day. It was the core, smooth and sealed and utterly unbothered. I poured the last of the scotch down the drain, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. I lay in the dark, and I thought about my mother, who had died in a nursing home in 1999 because no one in our family had planned well enough. I thought about the women I had worked with at Hartford Hospital, Nurses in their 60s who had given everything to their families and then found themselves with nothing secured, nobody advocating for them, nobody showing up. I had watched that happen to other people my entire career. I had always told myself I would not let it happen to me. By morning, I knew what I needed to do. The first call I made was to Claire. I did not tell her everything, not yet. I simply said I had been doing some thinking about estate planning and asked whether she might be able to come visit the following weekend. She said yes without hesitation. She rearranged her schedule. Of course she did. That is who Claire is. The second call I made was to Gerald Marsh's office. His receptionist said he had an opening on Wednesday afternoon, and I said I would take it. I did not call Daniel. Over the next few days, I began the slow, methodical work of understanding exactly where I stood. I pulled my financial statements and laid them out on the kitchen table in order. The brokerage account, the IRA, the 401k from my years at the hospital, the savings, the life insurance policy. I listed the assets of the house, paid off in full in 2016, assessed at just over $640,000 in the last municipal evaluation. I wrote down Robert's pension, which continued to pay out to me as a survivor benefit. I was not, as it turned out, in a precarious position. I had been careful. Robert and I had always been careful. But I had also been operating under the assumption that my financial future existed within a family structure, or a web of mutual obligation and care. Daniel's words on Saturday had quietly removed him from that web. He had removed himself. He had been explicit about it. What remained was the question of what I intended to do with that fact. Claire arrived on Friday evening, and we sat on the back porch with glasses of wine while the sky went orange and then purple over the tree line. I told her what Daniel had said. I told her precisely, word for word. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "Mama, that breaks my heart for you. Not for her, for me. That is the difference between my two children distilled into a single sentence." I reached over and covered her hand with mine. "Don't be broken," I said. "Be practical." I told her I had an appointment with Gerald on Wednesday. I told her I was thinking clearly, and I was not acting out of anger. I was acting out of clarity. She nodded. She understood. What I did not tell her, what I had not yet fully formed even in my own mind, was the shape of the plan that was beginning to take hold. Something quiet, something legal, something that would take time and patience and the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from having already felt it all the way through. Wednesday was coming. I had a great deal to think about before then. Gerald Marsh's office is on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street in Farmington, above a jeweler's shop that has been there since 1974. The stairs creak on the third step. I have climbed them enough times now to know that. I had climbed them with Robert. I climbed them alone on that Wednesday afternoon in October, wearing a gray wool coat and carrying a folder with every document Gerald had asked me to bring. Gerald is 71. 6 years older than me, with reading glasses he wears pushed up on his forehead until he actually needs them. He has a calm, unhurried manner that I have always found reassuring. He offered me coffee. I accepted. We sat across from each other at his desk, and I told him what had happened. I told him what Daniel had said. I told him I wanted to revise the will. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk and asked me 2 questions. Was I acting under any pressure or coercion? And had I thought this through over a period of days rather than hours? Yes, I said, and yes. He nodded and pulled up my file on his computer. We spent 90 minutes going through the details. The changes I wanted were not complicated, but they were significant. The house, the investment accounts, and the bulk of the liquid assets would go to Claire, in full. A charitable remainder trust would be established with a portion of the estate. Robert had always wanted to give to the children's hospital where I had worked, and now seemed like the right moment to formalize that. Daniel would receive his father's watch, which I had already set aside, and a modest sum. Enough to be respectful, not enough to be rewarding. Gerald drafted the revised language. I read every word. I signed where he indicated. When it was done, Gerald removed his glasses from his forehead, set them on the desk, and said, "You know, Maggie, in 30 years of practice, the clients who make decisions like this one, quietly, without drama, with this kind of clarity, are almost always the ones who've already grieved what they needed to grieve. I think you're going to be all right." I thanked him. I meant it. What I did not know, walking back down those creaking stairs onto Main Street, was that the walls had already begun to move. Brittany had called Claire the week before my appointment with Gerald. I learned this afterward from Claire herself, who mentioned it almost in passing. A friendly check-in, she said, Brittany asking how things were, whether I seemed well, whether I had seemed upset about anything lately. Claire had not read too much into it at the time. She had given nothing away. She hadn't known what I was planning. But she told me about the call, and I sat with it. Brittany calling Claire out of the blue, checking in, asking whether I seemed upset. Brittany, who had not called Claire in 2 years. I have been a nurse for 3 decades. I know what it looks like when someone takes your pulse without telling you they're doing it. The confirmation came 4 days later. I was carrying groceries in from the car on a Friday afternoon when my neighbor Patricia, who has lived across the street from me for 22 years and who knows the rhythms of this neighborhood better than anyone, came across the lawn to help me with a bag and said, almost apologetically, "Maggie, I don't want to be a busybody, but there was a car parked on the street Tuesday morning across from your driveway for about an hour. I didn't recognize it. Dark blue SUV, newer. I wrote down the plate out of habit because my grandson taught me to." She pressed a small piece of paper into my hand. Probably nothing. I looked at the plate number. 2 days later, I ran it through a contact I had kept from my years on the hospital's patient advocacy board. A woman who had worked in insurance investigation before she retired and who owed me a favor from 2019. She called me back on a Thursday morning. The SUV was a rental. Rented from an enterprise location in Fairfield. Rented on a Tuesday morning. Daniel and Brittany live in Fairfield. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, looking out the window at the bare branches of the oak tree Robert had planted the year Daniel was born. It had been 43 years. The tree was enormous now. So, they were watching the house, checking on my movements, something I had done, some vibration they had felt, had put them on alert. I thought back through the previous 2 weeks, trying to find the source. Perhaps Gerald's office had called my home number for a scheduling detail, and Daniel still had access to my landline's shared plan from years ago. Perhaps it was simply intuition. Brittany had always had predatory instincts, and she may have read something in my face the evening Daniel came to collect his father's golf clubs. It did not matter how they knew. What mattered was that they did. I set the phone on the counter very deliberately, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Relief. Because now there was no ambiguity. Now I knew exactly who I was dealing with. The surveillance, the call to Claire, the careful orchestration of it. This was not a son worried about his mother. This was a calculation. This was Brittany's fingerprints all over my porch, checking to see what was inside. I had signed the revised will 6 days ago. They were already too late. I had one more step to take before the plan was complete. It was the most important one, and I had been deliberate about timing it carefully. The following Monday, I drove to my bank, First Connecticut Savings, where Robert and I had kept our accounts for 30 years, and I sat down with the branch manager, a woman named Diane, who had known us since before the children were in high school. I had already spoken to Gerald about this, and he had given me the appropriate documentation. Within the hour, I had restructured the beneficiary designations on my accounts to reflect the new will. The retirement accounts, the savings, all of it realigned. Diane walked me through each form with the thoroughness I had always appreciated in her. On the drive home, I stopped at the Children's Hospital on Farmington Avenue and dropped off a sealed letter addressed to the development office, confirming my intent to establish the trust Gerald and I had discussed. The receptionist, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, thanked me and said they would be in touch. It was done. I thought I would feel lighter. Instead, I felt very still, the way the air feels before a storm. The call came on Thursday. I was in the garden, the back garden, turning over the last of the autumn beds, when my cell phone rang. Daniel's name on the screen. I pulled off my glove and answered. Mom. His voice was different from the Saturday he had come for the golf clubs. The seal was gone. Something underneath it had cracked through. I need to talk to you. Of course, I said. Not on the phone. Can I come up Saturday? You're always welcome, Daniel. He arrived at 11 in the morning. Brittany was with him. I had not expected that, though I suppose I should have. She was wearing a cashmere turtleneck and a careful expression, and she carried a small arrangement of flowers that she held out to me in the doorway, like an offering. I thanked her and put them on the kitchen counter and did not look at them again. We sat in the living room. I brought coffee. I sat in Robert's armchair. They sat together on the sofa, and I noticed how Brittany had positioned herself, slightly forward, slightly ahead of Daniel, the way a person sits when they intend to lead. Mom, Daniel began, we've heard some things that concern us, about changes you might be making to your estate plans. I looked at him evenly. Have you? I don't know where it came from, he said, and the lie was so smooth that if I hadn't known to look for it, I might have missed it. But we're worried about you. That kind of decision, that's a big thing to do alone, without talking to family. I talked to my attorney, I said. Brittany smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Maggie, we're not trying to make this adversarial. We're family. We love you. We just want to make sure you're not making decisions that you might regret, decisions that could affect everyone. Everyone. What a careful word. I'm not going to regret it, I said. Daniel leaned forward. The sealed quality had returned to his voice, but now it carried something else underneath it. Pressure, like a thumb pressed against a bruise. Mom, I want you to think about what you're doing here. If you're angry about something I said, fine. I understand. But cutting me out of a will I've been in my entire life, that's not something you can just... I didn't cut you out, I said. You will receive your father's watch, which he always wanted you to have, and a sum that I've designated. The room went quiet. Brittany's smile disappeared. Something crossed her face that was much closer to her actual expression, cold, assessing, furious in the way of a person who has just realized that the board has already been cleared while they were still planning their first move. How much? Daniel said. That's between me and my attorney. Mom. Daniel. My voice was quiet, not raised, not shaking. You sat in this room 3 weeks ago and told me, clearly and without apology, that you had made a decision about your role in my life. I listened. I believed you, and I made a decision of my own. That is the beginning and the end of it. Brittany stood. This is completely unreasonable. You're punishing him for being honest with you. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm planning, which is what adults do. They left 40 minutes later. Daniel at the door turned back and said something I won't repeat here. Not because it hurt me, but because it was so entirely beneath him that I prefer not to give it room. Brittany said nothing. She walked to the car without looking back. I stood in the doorway and watched them go. Then I closed the door, went to the kitchen, and made myself a cup of tea. That weekend, I drove to the Berkshires. I had a small reservation at an inn I had stayed at twice before, once with Robert in the early years, once with Claire the autumn after he died. I walked the trails for 3 days. I ate well. I read a novel I had been meaning to get to for a year. I slept 8 hours a night. I had earned the quiet. I returned from the Berkshires on a Tuesday, and by Thursday a letter had arrived. It was not from Daniel's personal address. It was from an attorney, a firm in Stamford I had never heard of, with an embossed letterhead and 3 partners' names listed across the top. The letter was formal and carefully worded, and what it essentially said, stripped of its legal scaffolding, was this: Daniel's representatives wish to open a conversation regarding the estate of Robert Holloway and the management of certain assets, and they wanted to schedule a call at my earliest convenience. I read it twice. Then I set it on the kitchen counter beside the flowers Brittany had brought, which had wilted now in their arrangement, brown at the edges. I thought, so this is who they've decided to be. I called Gerald that afternoon and read him the letter over the phone. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Maggie, you haven't done anything wrong. Everything we filed is clean and legal and entirely your right as the sole surviving account holder. This letter is a fishing expedition. They're trying to see if you'll flinch. I won't, I said. I know you won't, he said, but let me write them back and make that clear. He did, professionally and precisely and without a single word of hostility. Just the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly what the law permits and is entirely unbothered by attempts to obscure it. 3 days later, Daniel called again. Not the attorney. Daniel himself from his personal number on a Sunday evening. I let it ring. I sat in the living room with my novel and I let it ring. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. There was nothing new he could say. The conversation that needed to happen had already happened. Anything further was theater, and I had no interest in the performance. He called twice more that week. The second time, he left a voicemail. His voice on the message was different again, softer, almost tentative. The voice of a much younger man. He said he missed me. He said Brittany hadn't meant to upset me. He said maybe they could all have dinner and talk things through like a family. I saved the voicemail. Not because I was moved by it, though I am honest enough to admit that some small, stubborn part of me was. I saved it because a woman who has worked in hospitals for 30 years knows that you document everything. The real anchor in that period was Eleanor. Eleanor Vance has been my closest friend since we met in the hospital break room in 1994. She is 72, recently retired, sharp as a tack, and entirely without patience for what she calls the theater of adult children who confused inheritance with love. She drove up from New Haven on a Wednesday with a pot of her mother's recipe chili and a bottle of Burgundy, and we sat at the kitchen table until midnight. I told her everything, all of it, from the evening with the golf clubs to the Stamford attorney's letter to the voicemail. Eleanor listened. She asked 4 questions, each one precise and practical. Then she refilled her glass and said, "Maggie, you know what Robert would say." "Tell me," I said, because I wanted to hear someone else say it. He would say, "You spent 40 years building something solid. Don't apologize for knowing where it belongs." I nodded. My eyes stung briefly. I let them. Eleanor also said something else that I carried with me in the weeks that followed. She said, "The people who fight hardest against your right to make your own decisions are always the people who were counting on you not to." I thought about that a great deal. I also, in that period, reached out to 2 other people. My doctor, Linda Perez, who I asked, deliberately on record, to note in my file that I was in excellent health and fully competent, and had told her so in person on that date, and my neighbor Patricia, who I thanked for the plate number and asked if she would be willing, if it ever came to it, to speak to what she had observed. She said yes immediately, with the particular warmth of a person who has been waiting to be useful. I was building something, quietly, carefully. The way I had always built things, not with drama, but with attention. Daniel and Brittany were watching. I could feel it, but they hadn't moved yet. I went about my days. I gardened. I walked. I had dinner with Eleanor on Fridays. I read in the evenings in Robert's armchair and listened to the house settle around me. I was not afraid. The Sunday they arrived without calling first was the Sunday after Thanksgiving. I had spent the holiday with Claire, who had flown in from Portland and spent 4 days with me. We had cooked together. Turkey, roasted sweet potatoes, the cranberry sauce with orange zest that Robert's mother had made and that I had never stopped making in her memory. Claire and I had eaten at the dining room table with the good china, and we had talked for hours, and she had slept in the guest room and made me coffee each morning, and on her last night we had looked at old photographs together until we were laughing about nothing in particular, and then, for a little while, not laughing at all. She flew home on Saturday. The house was mine again, quiet and full of the smell of the holidays, and I was standing at the kitchen sink washing the last of the baking dishes when I heard a car in the drive. I dried my hands. I looked out the window. Daniel's car. the black Audi, and behind it, a second vehicle, one I didn't recognize, a silver sedan. I watched them get out. Daniel and Brittany from the first car. From the second, a man I had never seen before. He was perhaps 50 in a dark coat carrying a leather folder. They knocked. I opened the door. "Mom." Daniel smiled, and it was the most elaborate performance I had seen from him yet. He had been coached. I could see the effort in every muscle of his face. I know we should have called. We were in the area and we thought, maybe we could talk. All of us. Like a family. Brittany had brought flowers again. Different ones this time. She held them out. I accepted them and set them on the hall table. "Who is this?" I asked, nodding at the man in the dark coat. "This is Martin," Daniel said. "He's someone who helps families navigate estate conversations when things get complicated." Martin extended his hand. I shook it because I was raised well. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I've heard a great deal about you. I want you to know I'm here purely in a supportive capacity, to help facilitate—" "I have an attorney," I said. "His name is Gerald Marsh. I'm sure you can schedule something through his office." "Of course," Martin said, with the practiced ease of a man paid to make things seem reasonable. "We just thought an informal conversation might be more comfortable than—" "Come in," I said. We sat in the living room. I did not offer coffee this time. What followed was 45 minutes of the most careful, sustained manipulation I have ever had the displeasure of witnessing from a close distance. Martin led it. He was skilled, I'll grant him that, beginning with sympathetic language about family, about the difficulty of aging, about how confusing and overwhelming estate decisions could be when one was alone. He used the word alone 7 times. I counted. Brittany joined in at the moments Martin had clearly designated for her. She spoke about love. She spoke about Daniel's childhood, about his relationship with his father, about how much it would have broken Robert's heart to see the family divided like this. She looked at me with her eyes slightly wet, genuinely, impressively wet, and said, "Maggie, we just want you to know that whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it without us." I looked at the 3 of them. What I was witnessing was a machine, a coordinated, rehearsed machine, and the machine was telling me that I was fragile, confused, alone, and in need of their guidance, and that if I would simply agree to revisit the will, to bring Daniel back into his proper position, then everything would be warm again, and I would not have to be alone. It was, I thought, almost impressive in its construction. Almost. "Brittany," I said when she had finished, "do you remember the Thanksgiving 3 years ago when I called Daniel 4 times to confirm what time you were arriving, and he never called back, and I found out 2 days later that you had been in Scottsdale since the Thursday before?" Silence. "Or the Christmas Daniel sent flowers to the hospital when I had my knee replaced? Beautiful flowers. Lovely card. He didn't visit." Brittany's eyes dried very quickly after that. "Martin," I said, "I appreciate your time. I want to be very clear. I am not confused. I am not overwhelmed. I am not alone. I have an attorney, a doctor who has documented my full mental competency, and a daughter who visited me for 4 days and is a phone call away. My decisions are final and legally sound, and I would like you to leave my home now." Martin closed his leather folder. Daniel's face had gone very still. Brittany was looking at a point somewhere past my left shoulder. "Mom," Daniel started. "Daniel." My voice was quiet. "I love you. I will always love you. But I will not be managed. Not in my own home." They left. Martin first, then Brittany, then Daniel, who paused on the porch and turned back with an expression I will not forget. Something between grief and fury, the two things knotted so tightly together they had become indistinguishable. After I closed the door, I stood in the hallway for a long moment. There was fear. I want to be honest. There was a cold thread of it moving through me. Not because I doubted my decisions, but because I had looked into my son's eyes and seen how much of a stranger he had become, and that is a loss that no legal document can fully address. But the fear did not weaken me. It clarified me. It burned off the last of the sentiment that had been softening my edges for weeks, and what remained underneath was clean and hard and entirely certain. I went to the kitchen. I called Eleanor. "They came," I said. "I know," she said. "Come for dinner." I did. The unraveling came in February, on a day so cold the windows had frosted at the edges overnight. Gerald had been quietly monitoring things since the letter from the Stanford firm, and in early January he had received a second letter, this one significantly more aggressive in tone. It alleged, in careful but unmistakable language, that I had made my estate revisions under conditions of emotional distress and potential undue influence, and that Daniel, as an interested party, intended to explore all available legal remedies. In other words, they were going to claim I hadn't been in my right mind. This is not an uncommon strategy. Gerald told me so, calmly, over the phone. Adult children contest wills on grounds of incapacity or undue influence more often than most people realize. The hope is that the threat alone will be enough to bring the other party to the table. He said, "They need to prove this before a probate court. They cannot do that. We have your doctor's documentation, the timeline of your decisions, my own detailed notes from our consultation. And frankly, Maggie, you are one of the most demonstrably competent clients I have ever represented. This is theater, but we need to meet it directly." Gerald requested a formal meeting. He suggested we invite Daniel and his attorney to his office in Farmington on neutral ground with the full documentation laid out. Daniel's Stanford attorney agreed to the date. It was a Wednesday. I wore the navy blazer I had bought for Claire's college graduation. Gerald's conference room is spare and well lit, with a long table of pale wood and a window that looks out onto Main Street. I arrived early and sat on one side of the table. Gerald sat beside me. Across from us, 20 minutes later, Daniel, Brittany, who had not been invited but who had come anyway and whom no one had the authority to remove, and a man named Stephen Carver, the Stanford attorney, who wore a very good suit and had the confident manner of someone accustomed to rooms like this one. Carver opened. He laid out their position with fluency. My age, the suddenness of the changes, the lack of consultation with immediate family, the potential exploitation by outside parties. That last phrase aimed, I understood, at Gerald himself, whom they were suggesting had manipulated me. I watched Daniel while Carver spoke. He was looking at the table. Brittany was looking at me. She had a very specific expression, the expression of a person who believes they are sitting in the winner's chair and is allowing themselves the small pleasure of showing it. When Carver finished, Gerald spoke. He did not raise his voice. He placed documents on the table as he went, the dated records from my appointment, the contemporaneous notes documenting my stated reasoning, the letter from Dr. Perez confirming my full mental competency, recorded on a date that was, Gerald pointed out, 17 days before my appointment with him. He placed the bank records showing that no third party had access to or had influenced my accounts. He placed a printed summary of Connecticut estate law with the relevant statutes highlighted. Mrs. Holloway made these decisions across a period of 3 weeks, Gerald said, with full legal counsel, full medical documentation of competency, and zero involvement from any external party. The estate is entirely hers to distribute as she chooses, and she has done so. If your client wishes to pursue a contest, he is within his rights to do so. I would encourage you to review the evidentiary threshold required for a successful claim of undue influence in this jurisdiction. The standard is substantial. The evidence here does not meet it. Silence. Then Brittany spoke. She shouldn't have. That was her mistake. "This is absurd," she said, and her voice had finally dropped the performance, the warmth, the concern, the careful management. What was underneath it was raw and hot. You've spent 40 years building something and you're handing it to your daughter because your son had one honest conversation with you. That's spite. That's not estate planning, that's Brittany. Carver put his hand on the table between them, a quiet signal. She ignored it. "Daniel has been nothing but respectful. He told me not to expect care from him," I said. My voice was level, completely level. In my home, at my table, over a dinner I had cooked for him. He said it clearly and without apology. I believed him. I acted accordingly. That is the entire story. Daniel looked up from the table. His face, for the first time in months, was unmanaged, raw in the way that only happens when every rehearsed version of events has finally run out. "Mom," he said. "I'm not angry with you, Daniel," I said, and the truest, strangest thing was that it was completely true. I was, and then I wasn't. I simply believed you. You told me who you were going to be in my life. I listened. I adjusted. That's all. Brittany stood up. "You're punishing him," she said, and now she was pointing, actually pointing, across the table. "You're punishing him because he married me, because he had a life of his own, because you couldn't—" "Brittany." Carver stood as well. His voice was quiet and firm. "Please don't continue." She sat. Her face was crimson. Her hands were shaking very slightly. Carver looked across the table at Gerald and said, in the practiced tone of a man retreating with dignity, "We'll be in touch." They left. Daniel last. At the door he turned and looked at me, and I held his gaze, and neither of us said anything, and then he turned and walked out into the February cold. Gerald closed the conference room door and exhaled slowly. "Well," he said. "Yes," I said. He offered me a cup of coffee. I accepted. We sat together in the quiet conference room for a few minutes, looking out at the street where Daniel's car was pulling away from the curb. I thought, it is done. 3 weeks after the meeting in Gerald's office, Carver sent a single-page letter withdrawing the claim. Gerald called me on the afternoon it arrived and read it to me over the phone, and I sat in the kitchen and listened, and when he finished I said, "Thank you, Gerald, for everything." "Thank you," he said. "It's been genuinely satisfying." That was it. No courtroom, no dramatic reversal. Just a single page on Stanford letterhead, folded in thirds that said, in the precise and bloodless language of law, that Daniel Holloway would not be pursuing further action regarding the estate of Margaret Ellen Holloway. I had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something quieter, a settling, like the last piece of a very large thing finally finding its place. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I looked out at the oak tree. It was still February and the branches were bare, but I could see where the buds were already forming at the tips, small and tight, waiting for the warmth. Within the month, several things happened in sequence. Gerald finalized the Charitable Remainder Trust. I went in person to meet with the development team at the Children's Hospital, and they told me the trust would fund a nursing scholarship in Robert's name, a full scholarship, renewable annually, for a registered nurse pursuing advanced certification. I signed the papers in their conference room, and on the way out I walked through the main corridor, the one I had walked down hundreds of times over 30 years, and I felt Robert beside me so strongly that I had to stop for a moment and put my hand on the wall. Gerald also helped me establish a formal healthcare directive and an updated power of attorney, designating Claire. She flew out in March. She'd taken to flying out every 6 weeks or so, which she said was partly for me and partly because she had decided she liked the East Coast in a way she hadn't when she was younger. I was not going to argue with her logic. We sat with Gerald one afternoon and went through everything together. Claire asked careful questions. She read every document before she signed anything. When we were done, Gerald shook her hand and said, "Your mother raised someone with a good head on her shoulders." Claire looked at me, and I looked at her, and we did not make a scene in Gerald's office, but it was a near thing. In April, the Stamford firm sent a final accounting of their fees to Daniel. I know this only because Patricia mentioned in passing that she had seen a FedEx truck at Daniel's parents-in-law's house. Brittany's parents lived 20 minutes away, and that Brittany's mother had been at the pharmacy and looked, in Patricia's careful phrasing, like someone who'd had a difficult week. In May, I received a letter from Daniel, not through an attorney, his own handwriting on plain paper in an envelope with no return address. 4 paragraphs. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't meant it the way it had sounded. He said Brittany and he had been going through a hard period and he had taken it out on me. He said he wished things were different. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it in the drawer with the voicemail transcript I had saved. I did not respond, not out of cruelty. Out of the same quiet certainty that had carried me through all of it, that there are some things that cannot be taken back by an apology, not because the person writing the apology isn't genuinely sorry, but because the apology doesn't change what was revealed. Daniel had shown me, under no duress and with full clarity, what he had decided about his role in my life. An apology 4 months later, after a legal defeat, did not revise that revelation. What I did instead, I called Claire. I told her about the letter. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you want to do, Mama?" "Nothing," I said. "Not yet, maybe not ever. I haven't decided." "That's okay," she said. "You don't have to decide." That is the gift of having built the kind of relationship where you don't have to decide things immediately, where the ground under you is stable enough to wait. The house was mine. The estate was settled. The scholarship was funded in Robert's name. Claire held my power of attorney. My doctor's records were in order. My finances were structured with care and precision and the full protection of the law. I had not raised my voice once through all of it. I had not made a single decision I would need to regret. The summer that followed was the best I had spent in years. I repainted the back porch in the color Robert had always wanted, a deep slate blue, and bought a hammock for the corner of the yard between the oak tree and the fence. I spent July mornings reading in it with coffee, and July evenings with a glass of wine, and both felt equally like something I had earned. Claire came for 2 weeks in August. We drove up to Vermont, walked along the river in the mornings, talked about Robert and the future and nothing in particular. She mentioned a job offer in Boston. I told her Hartford was only 2 hours away, that I had a guest room and that the offer was permanent. She cried a little. So did I. We ordered dessert anyway. I began volunteering at the hospital twice a week, in the family waiting rooms, talking to parents whose children were patients. The chaplain coordinator told me after my first month that my presence had become something the families asked about by name. In the fall, the scholarship was awarded for the first time. The recipient was a young woman named Aisha, 26, 2 years into her nursing career. I shook her hand, told her about Robert briefly, and she listened with the focused attention of someone who already understood what it meant to care for another human being completely. I thought, this is where it belongs. Now, Daniel and Brittany. The legal fees had been significant. Carver's firm had not worked cheaply, and part of the cost had apparently fallen to Brittany's parents, who were, according to Patricia, considerably less enthusiastic about their son-in-law than before. By spring, Daniel's firm restructured. He was repositioned, laterally and downward. In April, they listed the Fairfield house and moved to something smaller in Milford. Brittany's Instagram had gone private and had not been updated since. In December, a card arrived. My name in his handwriting, a winter landscape on the front. Inside, just his name, Daniel. No message, no Brittany. I put it on the mantel. I did not discard it. I did not call him. The life I have now is mine. The house is mine. The mornings are mine. The oak tree, 43 years old, enormous, is still standing. And every spring, Robert Holloway's scholarship sends a young nurse back into the world with the tools to do what I spent my career doing. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Take care of yourself before the crisis arrives. Plan, document, know your worth. And I want to ask you sincerely, what would you have done? Would you have acted or waited, hoping things would change? There are no wrong answers, only honest ones. Thank you for being here. If this moved you, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your story.